All right, so I know the last lecture was really long. This one should be a little bit shorter, and for this lecture, we're going to cover section 3. So as we go through this section, we're going to talk about several different events that had a major role in polarizing or driving the North and the South apart. So emotions on both sides of the slavery issue were stirred up by Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Dred Scott case, and John Brown's activity. There was hatred and anger in both the North and the South, and the North got frustrated, the South started to build up its defenses, and so those were some of the things that were happening during this time period of the 1850s, that 10-year period right before the Civil War. First, we need to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it tells the story of a slave named Uncle Tom, and he's owned by several different masters throughout his time as a slave. So considering the circumstances surrounding the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel's success was phenomenal. Its first day on the market, it sold 3,000 copies. At the end of the first year, it had sold 300,000 copies. Eventually, 3 million copies were in circulation, and the book was translated into 22 different languages. Stowe based much of her novel on the life of a slave named Josiah Henson, who wrote an autobiography that detailed the hardships of a slave. Stowe used that information to create Uncle Tom. When Stowe documented the accuracy of her novel, Frederick Douglass, who we talked about in the last section, the last lecture, he was a former slave. He said, "The most unwise thing which perhaps was ever done by slaveholders in order to hide the ugly features of slavery was calling into question and denying the truthfulness of Uncle Tom's Cabin." So, it became one of the most influential novels ever written, and it did not slow down the approach of the Civil War. It might have even sped it up. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, first event in this list that did not slow down the approach of the Civil War. Next, we need to talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act was proposed by Stephen Douglas, and he was proposing popular sovereignty. We learned about popular sovereignty in the last chapter, and popular sovereignty was the idea that territories could choose to be slave or free. So Stephen Douglas was interested in establishing Kansas and Nebraska as territories because they were close to the Transcontinental Railroad. He believed that the railroad would benefit the middle of the country, and particularly his state, which was Illinois. So he introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the bill's supporters expected that the northern of the two territories, Nebraska, would choose to be free, and that the southern of the two territories, Kansas, would end up being slave. And so then we would continue to preserve the delicate balance between the slave states and the free states. So the bill did pass, and both sides, the Northerners opposing slavery and the Southerners supporting slavery, encouraged people to move to these two different states to try and sway the vote. This region became known, so there we go, the bill passed. Both sides encouraged people to move there, and this area became known as Bleeding Kansas. So this area became known as Bleeding Kansas because there was a lot of fierce fighting, and lots of people ended up losing their lives as a result of the fighting. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, again, something that leads to the Civil War, and it was a very bloody time period in our history. So Kansas-Nebraska Act led to Bleeding Kansas. All right, so we see the Republican Party rising up in power again during this time. The Whigs split into two factions over slavery, and the Republican Party was formed, pretty much reformed, in 1854. And the platform of the Republican Party was no slavery. So the platform of the Republican Party, or one of the main things that the Republicans stood for, was no slavery. Next thing we need to talk about is the Dred Scott decision. We're going to skip the Sumner Brooks incident. I'm pretty sure you understood what happened there. So let's talk about Dred Scott. So Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Wisconsin for a short period of time with his master, who was an army doctor. And because he had lived in the state of Wisconsin, when the army doctor passed away, Dred Scott felt like that he should be able to be free. He had lived in a free state, therefore he should be a free man. Make sure you understand this case. So basically, Dred Scott was claiming he lived in a free state, and so when his master died, he should be free. Unfortunately for him, the Supreme Court did not agree with his position, and the ruling was that Dred Scott didn't even have a right to sue because he was a slave, and a slave doesn't have rights. Basically, Scott was ruled to be a piece of furniture. Does a piece of furniture have rights? No. Can it be passed from one family member to another family member? Yes. And so the bottom line was that Scott didn't have the right to sue because he was a slave, and being a slave, he was like a piece of furniture. The fallout was the South was rejoicing because the United States Supreme Court had upheld slavery, and they stopped Congress from dictating slave or free states. The Republicans had a setback, but of course they wouldn't be silenced. You need to remember who ruled in this case. The Chief Justice was Roger B. Taney. We've talked about him. He was put into power right after Andrew Jackson, and so Supreme Court Justice ruling in this case, Roger B. Taney. Supreme Court Chief Justice, Robert B. Taney. With this case, with the Dred Scott decision, the idea of compromise was gone. After this decision, the idea for compromise was gone. After this decision, no more compromises were made. All right, now we need to talk about John Brown. John Brown was a very interesting man. He was a radical abolitionist who advocated violence. He didn't just want to free the slaves, he wanted to use violence against people who would not free the slaves. So he went to Kansas. He was from Nebraska, and he went to Kansas, and he murdered 5 pro-slavery men. So let me read to you about John Brown and slavery. John Brown was unwavering in his dedication to the cause of abolition and advocated unlawful and bloody means to end slavery. Long before the massacre in Kansas or the raid at Harper's Ferry, which we'll talk about on the next slide, Brown was championing the causes of freedom for the slaves. He actively fought to assist runaways and lived for a time in a community of free blacks. He settled in Kansas in October of 1855, right in the middle of the Bleeding Kansas issue. Pro-slavery forces raided Lawrence, which was a free soil settlement in May of 1856, and in response to that, John Brown and 4 of his adult sons killed 5 men in the pro-slavery settlement. After the massacre, Brown led attacks against pro-slavery armed forces. He even went into Missouri to lead a band of slaves to Canada, and all of these activities got John Brown excited and ready to try and free slaves on an even bigger scale, which takes us to Harper's Ferry. All right, Harper's Ferry. So in October of 1859, John Brown started this raid from a rented farmhouse in Maryland. He and his followers, 13 white men and 5 black men, crossed the Potomac River into Virginia. So Harper's Ferry is in modern-day West Virginia, which would have been part of the state of Virginia at this point in time. He crossed the Potomac River into Virginia, and his men planned to capture and hold Harper's Ferry, including the bridges over the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, and that gave access to the town. So while he was in Harper's Ferry, he seized the federal arsenal, and that's when events, because he wanted to arm slaves and lead a revolt in the South. But things didn't go quite as well as John Brown had planned. He entered the town on October 16th, seized control of the arsenal, and his men cut off access to the town and seized hostages. They set up their headquarters in a fire engine house of the Armory complex, and that was the beginning of the end for John Brown. He expected droves of slaves to come and join him, but they never did. He also didn't expect the Virginians to act the way that they did and be able to stop him, because the Virginians sent Robert E. Lee to Harper's Ferry to fight against John Brown. Now, recognize the name Robert E. Lee, because he will be the general for the Confederate States of America when we get to the Civil War. So John Brown realized that there was not an immediate response from the local slave population. He could have escaped, but he insisted on staying where he was. His decision gave the local militia time to cut off all of his escape routes. Federal troops were on the scene on the evening of October 17th, so basically one day later. They stormed the engine house the next morning, killed some of the insurgents, and took the rest into custody. Several men, including Brown, were tried and executed in Charlestown, Virginia on December the 2nd. And as a result, John Brown became a martyr for the abolitionists. Whether he should have been or not, that was his status. So all of these events in this section led to the North and the South getting further and further apart, and started to lead to the next few events, which we'll cover in the next section.